very fortunate, in fact, to have Dan Blumstein join us as our on-air Coursera researcher. Dan has a terrific career history of conducting research in a range of mostly mammals, working in both North America and Australia, and quite likely elsewhere as well. So, welcome, Dan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
That's very much our pleasure as well. So, what we'll do is introduce all of the people who's joined us directly in the Google Hangout, and what I'd like each of you to do is just to very briefly, in a couple of sentences, explain who you are and perhaps your interests in animal behaviour. So I'll come back to you.
Okay, I'll start if you like. So
okay.
My name's Millie Formby. I'm from Perth in Western Australia, and I'm the community teaching assistant for the Coursera course this year again. And yeah, I've had a love of animals for years, an interest in animal behaviour. I did my master's with Raoul, who's running the course on black swans, and in particular I'm interested in communication. So I'll hand over to Ryan, I guess. Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself? No?
Oh, looks like Ryan's disappeared.
Oh, that's okay. Well, I'll ask. You're here? Okay, Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Ryan. I am from California, in Bogota, Colombia, with the Nature Conservancy, and I have a intersection of animal behavior and sports. So almost like biomimicry in organizations, but applied behaviorally to sports organizations, mostly in North America.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. So Romulo, who's just joined us, would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, first, are you guys hearing me?
Yep, we can hear you perfectly. Yep.
Okay, that's fine. Well, last time I kind of introduced me for a long time, so I'm going to be short this time. So I'm basically I'm a biologist, I'm an ornithologist, and I'm currently doing a master's degree, and I'm working with evolution of plumage coloration and also a little bit of a reproductive system of birds, of course.
Thank you. Welcome. And then we have
Mariana.
Would you like to introduce?
Hi there. First of all, thank you for the excellent course. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, Mariana, my name, my interest, I love animals as well. I worked in Brazil for some time at the Amazon region for protection of wildlife, especially species that are in danger of extinction. And right now I'm working in the US for animal cruelty, and I'm looking forward into entering the science of wildlife.
Right. Good. Okay. How about Eduardo?
Okay. My name is Eduardo Bessa. I work in Mato Grosso, Brazil, where I teach animal behavior in the university here. I'm actually interested in parental care in fish, and I've been also doing some things on the impacts of ecotourism on fish behavior, which is how I met Dan.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Daniela.
Hi, I'm Daniela. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Yep.
Oh, which Daniela?
Okay.
Daniela, would you like to just introduce yourself?
Daniela, it's great.
Okay, okay, so that's me.
Yeah.
Hello, I am Daniela. I'm a psychologist, and I have a very big interest in biology in general, and I'm trying to figure out what to do next, like what to study next, and how to join psychology and biology. I love animal behavior, so I'm trying to get into it and see if that's the way I want to go. I also have a very big interest in conservation and in environmental topics in general.
Terrific, terrific. Danny, can you hear me, Danny? Danny? Daniela Quisani, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody
Hello.
here?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm Daniela. I'm also from Brazil, and I'm a biologist. I studied. I'm making a master in genetics, but I love animal behavior, and I must also say that this was the best Coursera course ever. It's the best one I've made so far. So thank you.
That's very kind of you. Great. And then I think Paula and Sebastian.
Hello. I'm studying biology in the University of Valle in Colombia. I'm interested in animal behavior because I find impressive the way things like symbiosis, social systems, and general interactions between individuals can emerge. I feel fascinated when I look at the evolutive history of these behaviors, but sometimes they can even go against the basic rules of survival.
Okay, I am Sebastián Páez. I also study in the Universidad del Valle with her, but I study computer science. I am interested in a field called artificial life. Well, I think animal behavior can get me a more deeper understanding of how life and complex systems work.
Right. Terrific. Okay. So I'm very happy to open the conversation. But Dan, perhaps just as an icebreaker, you could perhaps tell us what you're doing right now. Well, obviously, what you're doing right now is sitting in front of a video camera, but you're working at the Rocky Mountain Biological Labs, I think that's right, in fairly remote Colorado. And if you could perhaps just tell us what research you're absolutely engaging in this afternoon or this morning, that would be really great.
So I run a long-term study of yellow-bellied marmots in Colorado and the mountains of North America. The study's been going on since 1962. My colleague Ken Armitage, who's an emeritus professor, started the study. It's one of the longest-running studies of individually marked mammals that's going. We can talk about the value of long-term research. The lab that I'm working at is called the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. I have people come from all over the world to work with us on the marmots, and it's been raining a lot today. I had a videographer out who's doing a piece on some of our work, aspects of our work, and we got rained on a lot today. So it's been raining. It's been a cold and wet summer, for better or for worse. But normally, myself and my crew get up in the morning. We go out, we watch marmots for a couple of hours, depending upon where we are. These days, I'm more supervising than getting out and watching as much. I have 8 people here working with me right now, so there's a lot of coordination. We trap marmots and mark them. We study them throughout their lives, so we try not to hurt them, and we're pretty good at that. And then in the afternoon, if it's not raining, people go back out again. And look again. These days in the afternoon, I'm sort of sitting in front of a computer, writing and corresponding and doing things like this. But I've spent many, many years here and other places studying marmots, doing pretty intense field work in remote places. This is actually a pretty plush location, although we are at the end of a county, and the internet is really slow here.
I'm just going to ask one more question because I can. So do you not go out in the rain because it's wet and unpleasant, or because the marmots quite sensibly are in their burrows?
So marmots are hibernating rodents, and they have a very fine aesthetic sense that sort of matches the northern hemisphere academic calendar. They hibernate in the winter, so you're not missing anything. And then in the summer, if it's wet, they don't want to get wet. Some of my funnier moments watching marmots come out on wet, cold days as they, you're out there, it's wet and cold, and they come up really late in the day, maybe when it's a little drier and warmer, and they might come up and look around, and then they sort of get hungry, and they start moving out from their burrow, and their belly gets wet, and they're trying not to get their belly wet. And at some point, they resign themselves to being wet. So it was pissing on and off all morning today. We finally went out to this one meadow during a sun break, and all the marmots came up and basked on top of rocks like solar panels.
Great. Well, look, I'm not quite sure how you can put your hand up to ask questions, but really the idea of this hangout is to give everyone an opportunity to ask Dan questions. So I really open the floor now to any particular questions.
May I?
But yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, first, thank you, Dan, for being here and talking to us. I have your Google Scholar open here, and I've noticed you've been publishing some papers on escape behavior. And although the name is kind of self-explanatory, I never kind of read the paper on escape behavior. So I want you, since apparently it's the recent research you've been doing, could you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and why marmots? Why your study group are marmots?
Good questions. First, I'm going to do a shameless plug. This is a book. It just came out. You can get an electronic version of it or not. It's on escaping from predators and integrative view of escape decisions. Thank you for setting me up for that. Writing that book, editing that book was really, really fun. My colleague, Bill Cooper, who I've never met, by the way, I've never Skyped with, we email constantly, written papers, many papers. I invited him out here this summer and he couldn't make it. But in any event, we realized while writing that book, both of us were fascinated with escape behavior. And actually, I do study escape behavior in marmots, but I also study it in birds, and students and I study it in lizards, and we've done stuff with fish. And escape behavior is one of those things, if you've been learning about sexual selection and foraging behavior, where there's a really nice interface between models and theory and empirical tests. So, you know, in the 70s and 80s, everyone was obsessed with foraging models, and is there optimal foraging, and how do models work, and things like that. And how do you explain behavior, and how can you come up with conceptual views of behavior? And there's big fights in the 70s and 80s about optimal foraging. I think we've learned a hell of a lot about the adaptive value of behavior and constraints by this whole foraging revolution. But I think escape behavior has been one of those revolutions that's gone completely unnoticed. It was a silent revolution. And while editing this book and writing chapters in this book, we realized that if you look at the history of escape behavior, there was a very important model that came out in the 80s by Ron Eidenberg and Larry Dill that talked about, you know, if the predator moves towards an animal, animals will essentially flee. But they're not going to flee as soon as they detect the predator. And this led to a series of economic models with assumptions and predictions that largely have been validated. And then as we found more information and looked at more things, the models got more and more complex. So here's one of these wonderful behavioral ecology stories where models and mechanism and empirical studies and empiricists all worked together and created a really dynamic view of constraints on what prevents animals from maybe escaping, but also the rich variety of escape strategies that animals have that all really are probably pretty adaptive. So we walk towards animals a lot and measure something called flight initiation distance, FID. how close you can get to something before it buggers off. And we've done many comparative studies of this, meta-analyses of this, and have learned a lot about environmental factors and internal factors that influence escape in a variety of animals. The biggest data set out there is on birds. It's easy to walk towards birds. It's fun to walk towards birds. You don't hurt them when you walk towards them. Unless they're in the nest, and then I don't say walk towards them. And we've been able to look at the life history and natural history correlates of escape behavior as well. So it's one of these things that is a remarkably easy tool and technique to collect a lot of data that actually has shed light on adaptation and function and given us insights into life history and natural history correlates. I'm also interested in this not simply because of the theoretical reasons, but because of what Eduardo talked about earlier, which is the applications of this for conservation. And I know at least one other person here is interested in conservation. A question that has always puzzled me is why, when you put a hiking trail in, do you start losing species? And how can we understand why some species are tolerant of humans while other species are not tolerant of humans? And I and others have used these big comparative data sets of flight initiation distance to begin to make predictions and try to understand what species might be more or less vulnerable to human disturbance. And the interface between theory and mechanism and conservation and function, to me, is a really fun nexus that characterizes a lot of my work. That was a long answer, but buy the book.
Okay, thank you.
Can I be next?
Yes, Mariana.
Okay. Well, then, thanks for joining us. And my question is for animal behavior about communication. If they're voiceless animals, how can we read expressions or, what they want to say? What techniques do you use for that if it's a voiceless animal? How can we read real expression? What does it want to communicate?
So when you mean voiceless, do you mean does not communicate verbally? Or
Yes,
do you mean does not have
exactly.
language?
Right.
So
It
no
doesn't have.
acoustic communication.
Right.
So, there are different modalities for studying communication. And we often take what I say Humpty Dumpty apart, and we look at modalities in isolation. We look at acoustic modalities, and we try to understand what animals, what utterances are associated with things in the environment, or motivational states, or whatever, to try to understand function. We also can do the same thing for olfactory modalities, except it's much harder. There are tools and techniques using GC mass spec, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, to sort of image and come up with images of scents or chemicals in the environment or that might be produced by non-humans. And certainly people in the insect world have been very, very successful at understanding communication in the olfactory domains. We're struggling with a number of studies to better understand olfactory communication in the mammals I study, at least. It's easy to do experiments. It's hard to understand what is really driving differences, if you will. So you can get an olfactory secretion. You can rub something from a cheek of a marmot and put it on a cotton ball and ask marmots if they distinguish neighbors from strangers, as many species do. Or ask, can they distinguish males from females in various ways? But we're much more limited because we don't have the rich way of imaging or easily imaging the complexity of olfactory signals. I've been struggling with colleagues in Australia to try to develop sort of a non-harmful animal repellent based on dingo urine, with the idea that kangaroos and other species don't really like dingoes. And if we can make a synthetic dingo urine, maybe we can then use this to keep them off plantings and vegetation in sensitive areas. Problem is, if you look at dingo urine and you put it through a GC mass spec, you get like 300 chemicals, many of which can't be identified. And if you think about how perfume works, it's not necessarily there's like one chemical that drives everything, but it's the mix of those chemicals that makes it really, really hard to begin to study how logically to sort of make sense of all this stuff. It's remarkably complex. I mean, people in the insect chemical communication world have done it very, very, very well, but mammalian folks are still struggling. But then there's also visual signals and visual communication. And really, if you can measure it, if you can film it, if you can model it, you can begin to study it. So people now are using robots to have animals do things, do behavior. Again, in this case, divorced from the olfactory signals and divorced potentially of the acoustic signals to try to understand how that works. But then, ultimately, you want to put Humpty Dumpty back together again and try to come up with ways of studying these multimodal signals. And that's a really exciting field that not only deals with multimodal signals, meaning something one animal's doing to manipulate the behavior of others, but also multimodal risk assessment. So if I smell a predator, what does that tell me compared to if I see a predator? So up on my wall, up here, how's this work? There we go. Up there are a bunch of photographic animals that we've used and put out in the field to scare marmots. So they don't like wolves. But they also don't like, foxes. They don't like fox urine, and they don't really like coyotes or coyote urine, and they don't really like the sound of coyotes. So we've begun to do experiments to sort of put these together and see and try to understand in a very adaptive way when do you want information, when do you use, when is it valuable to have information from another modality. So I don't know if that answered your question, but really it's about trying to figure out ways to describe variation in whatever substrate that signal is in, and then look for associations with things in the environment that you might be interested in, and then do experiments where you manipulate those to try to see if you elicit different responses in various ways.
Then, did you ever use an oscilloscope for sound?
I have computers that have, sort of old-style oscilloscopes wired into the software. So there are many ways to quantify sounds in the temporal dimension, looking at waveforms. We're doing various transformations to look at spectrograms or power spectra.
Do you have a library of the spectra?
So we record sounds and then look at them and look at their structure and measure them in various ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Great.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Can I be next?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. It more or less follows from what Mariana was asking. You had this very nice study a few years ago, which you mostly called The Sound of Fear. I wanted you to tell us this story and explain more or less what did you do.
So I'll start off by saying, we study these marmots. We don't want to hurt them. And one day I'm holding this baby marmot that had just emerged from its burrow, and it screams. And I almost dropped it. And I sort of scratched my head and said, well, why did I almost drop it? Baby marmots alarm call all the time. But there's something about screams that was really compelling, and I had an emotional response to this. I hear, marmots call and make other birds sing, and I don't have emotional responses to that. But if you hear your dog barking or screaming, or you step on its toes, or your cat screaming, and it's really not happy, we tune into this. And I was wondering, what is it about screams that make us respond to them? So if you look at the structure of screams, they are complex and sort of predictably unpredictable ways. And what I mean by that is screams are characterized by nonlinear acoustic phenomena. And what I mean by that is that if you turn up your stereo, the sound will get louder and nicer and louder and nicer until at some point you're putting too much energy through your stereo system and the sound gets all distorted. That system has gone from a predictable state to an unpredictable state, and in bioacoustics we call that new system a nonlinear system, and you get specific sorts of nonlinear changes in many systems when you overpower them. So if I blow air across my syrinx if I'm a bird, or my vocal cords if I'm a mammal, and I say something louder and louder and louder and louder, at some point your voice breaks. It can't take it anymore. If you scream, I mean, you can do a sort of a dramatic movie star scream, or you could do a real scream. And real screams, you're probably creating a lot of turbulent flow and overblowing your system. It's not vibrating in a predictable way anymore. It vibrates in a nonlinear way. So these nonlinear sounds and acoustic elements, these nonlinear screams are characterized by a whole suite of these nonlinear processes. And it turns out that I think that these are very evocative. So if you look at screams across different species, they all have the same things. If you take normal vocalizations and add nonlinearities to them, they're more evocative. If you put noise, which is not really a nonlinearity, but it's kind of like deterministic chaos, in a marmot alarm call, you make it even more evocative. And if you look at movie soundtracks and look at the sounds in different sorts of movies, you find that horror films are characterized by more of these non-linear sorts of sounds. And then if you ask people, you make what I call marmot-inspired music, and you take sort of benign music and then you modify it with specific forms of these nonlinearities, you find that people think and feel and self-report that it is more arousing and it's less positive. So those are two dimensions of emotional responses. So there's something about these nonlinearities that are emotionally evocative in various ways. Then if you wire people up and ask them, do the same sorts of things where you play marmot-inspired music with specific forms of nonlinearities in them, turns out that the muscles in the eye, which are one of the autonomic nervous system responses, move in a particular way when these nonlinearities are played. So there not only is a self-reported emotional response, but there's also a biological emotional response. The next experiment, of course, is we want to put people in a tube and use functional magnetic resonance imaging and look for responses. And I have to say, I was just scooped this last week by someone who more or less did that, but they weren't looking at these nonlinear acoustic elements. There's a brilliant paper in current biology that just came out last week where they did a different sort of imaging, transformation of sound, and they defined something called roughness. Now, I don't understand if roughness is the same as nonlinearity. I haven't played around with the roughness metric yet. But what they found was that screams and other really alarming sounds occupy a space in sort of acoustic space, an area in acoustic space that they describe as being very rough. And then people think that these are more evocative, and they also specifically target the amygdala, which is high arousal, fearful sorts of sounds. So they actually did the functional magnetic resonance imaging with people to show that there are specific sorts of sounds that are particularly evocative and scary. They don't have that biological perspective that I've taken by being inspired by something I see in the field and then trying to understand humans. They're only trying to understand humans. So that's sort of the story in a nutshell.
It's terrific. More questions? Daniela, put your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. So I've had a hard time finding options on how to apply animal behavior to biodiversity conservation and environmental topics in general. Some research that I've read have written that the questions and the approaches that conservationists and animal behaviorists ask are maybe different or not compatible. And so my question is very general. How can our knowledge in animal behavior help to do something about the environment? And what would you advise
so I'm going to answer
that track?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that in two ways. And I've got a book for that, but I don't have it here. It's called Conservation Behavior, a primer on conservation behavior. And what my friend and colleague Esteban Fernandez-Grisic and I tried to do was sort of go through a series of behaviors that can be used and applied to conservation and management, just to get people thinking about how to think about that. And after taking this sort of a course, I think you'll be really primed to read that sort of a book and think about those things. However, I will answer that question more concisely than in the length of a primer. And that is that when I think about conservation, I also think about wildlife management. In conservation biology and biodiversity conservation, we're trying to get more of something. Numbers matter. Many wildlife management problems are you have a species that we've decided is a pest, or there are too many of something. And behavior has often, many behaviors, not all behaviors, but many behaviors have fitness consequences. And for behaviors that have fitness consequences, that means they can have demographic consequences. That means that if an animal does something right or wrong in a particular context, it may survive and reproduce, or it may die. So anytime, the easiest way to think and look for links between behaviors and conservation or management is by thinking about numbers. So what makes numbers go up? So, for example, understanding something very theoretical about why animals may be reproductively suppressed, which is sort of an arcane topic in social behavior, actually has profound implications for conservation biology if species in certain situations are suppressed, and if it's an endangered species and you're trying to get more of them, you're not going to get more of them. Jan Commodore did a study in the late 80s, early 90s, where he was trying to save the species and successfully save the Seychelles warbler from extinction by reintroducing them to different islands in the Seychelles. And what he also did was he ended up publishing Nature and Science papers looking and testing fundamental hypotheses about reproductive suppression and helping behavior, because when animals got constrained, the environment prevented them from, all individuals, from reproducing. So if you want to reproduce wolves, you probably want to break apart the wolf packs, right? Because we know that wolves have an alpha breeder, male, and an alpha breeder female, and no one else is able to reproduce. There are a lot of other ways that behavior can be useful for conservation. We're talking about communication before, and in many cases, understanding how and why animals are communicating may give us insight into how and why things we do in the environment are influencing that. So one perfect example is water pollution. For fish that require, that have sexual displays and courtship, maybe they can't make those proper mating decisions if the water is eutrophied and polluted and not clear. And people have demonstrated this in a number of places. Same thing with sounds and anthropogenic sounds. If there's too much noise in the environment in general, maybe it's hard to get a message across. And if these messages are important for the fitness of individuals, then they're potentially important for the population as a whole. Maybe you're interested in movement behavior. Why are animals moving where they're moving? Why aren't they moving where they're moving? How do you understand how to get animals to move where they move? So understanding dispersal and habitat selection mechanisms, really, I think are really important. Now, while I'm sort of talking about function, I'm also talking about mechanism here, because I think that mechanisms are the levers through which we can manipulate and understand how and why animals are doing certain things in certain times in certain places. And if we want to begin manipulating those things, we need to understand those mechanisms. So there are a variety of ways and a variety of behaviors that, I didn't even talk about anti-predator behavior, but I talked about that before. Anything animals do to stay alive is going to be very good for their individual fitness, but also good for that population. So understanding how we could distract animals, or things we do might be distracting or blocking them or preventing them from properly detecting predators or responding to predators, could be a real problem. So I think there's lots of ways that behavior ties into conservation. Learning. Learning is a huge one. Many animals have to learn how to do important things. Are there sensitive periods for that? Are there critical periods for learning? If we're taking animals from captivity and putting them into the wild for conservation, are we giving them opportunities to learn? Are we priming them and allowing them to learn appropriate things that will aid in their survival? Mate choice. Many captive breeding projects fail because it's hard to get animals to breed. What's going on with that? How can we understand from the animal's perspective better how it's making mate choice decisions? Maybe that can be useful for getting animals to breed better in captivity. So lots and lots and lots of ways.
I think to summarize, Daniela, it's probably fair to say that if you're not investigating animal behavior in any conservation project, then you're probably not getting a completely rich picture of all of the issues that are important.
I'm going to be an enthusiast and say absolutely. Then I'm going to be a skeptic and talk about evidence-based conservation, which is it either works or it doesn't work. It's either useful or it's not. But there are many people that sort of put their nose up and say, oh, behavior has no relevance for conservation. And I think it's a lost opportunity where in some cases it will give us sort of the killer app that's going to allow us to solve problems. And in many cases, maybe it won't. In many cases, other manipulations won't either. So I think that we need to create sort of an evidence-based field of conservation behavior.
Yeah.
I might jump in here. Students of mine have been investigating the reintroduction of a very rare insect, the Lord Howe Island stick insect. And it was collected off a small island where the food plants that it was feeding on are not found on the larger Lord Howe Island itself. So the process of reintroducing that species really required some knowledge about what the animal actually ate. And the reintroduction program was going ahead without, in fact, any knowledge of whether the plants that these insects feed on are readily available. And the only way you could work that out is through a series of lab-based experiments where you drew on all of the available plants on the island and simply asked the question of the insects, A, which do they like, and then B, of those that they do like, which do they thrive on and which they don't. And incidentally, what we found out is that the younger insects prefer quite different plants to the older insects. Now, without that knowledge, we could have gone ahead and reintroduced Lord Howe Island stick insect from very successful zoo captive breeding programs and put them out in the island, and they would have all perished because the food might not have been there. So I mean, Dan is absolutely right. You've got to get that balance between asking questions and behavior that are kind of interesting to ask, but perhaps peripheral to the overall objectives of whatever conservation program. Okay, too much from me already. I can't see Millie scowling, but that's a good thing. Now, how about Daniela Quinsani? Do you have a question?
Yes. I would like to hear a bit how genetics can help in animal behavior studies.
Good question.
How can genetics help in animal behavior studies? Well, I'm very interested in the degree to which, and one of the things we're studying here with these marmots, we've studied them over, this is our 54th year of study, and the climate has gotten warmer, and marmots that hibernate are waking up from hibernation a month earlier than they were about 40 years ago. So there is tremendous change in these high alpine meadows because of global heating and climate change. And one of those questions is how much of this is pretty hardwired in sort of a genetic way versus how much of it is what might be called phenotypic plasticity. How flexible are these animals in their ability to respond to these things? So we can find evidence of selection, but we're also not finding evolutionary responses here with traits we're looking at. We're finding heritable variation in traits, so we're doing a lot of quantitative genetics. We know who everyone's parents were, and then we can look at similarities among relatives, and we can say that these behaviors have this amount of heritability, but we don't seem to be running into genetic limits yet. We seem to be able to, the marmots at least, seem to be able to be this species at least, seems to be very phenotypically plastic. And to me, a really important question in sort of this context of climate change and conservation and how we're really screwing up the world is, are all species equally as plastic or not? And when will species run out of behavioral flexibility and run up against real hard evolutionary constraints? One way I've been thinking and using genetics, albeit quantitative genetics, getting into some genomics now with some students these days. We're interested in using gene expression studies, RNA studies, to try to understand how animals prepare themselves for moving out and trying to gain insights into why be social and what are the costs of sociality. So we're still working that stuff out. And another student has just started a marmot genome with questions that we have much more broadly about how selection for high altitude living or hibernation or other things associated with this hibernation syndrome